One of the things about aging is I tend not to look at myself in the mirror very often. I don't know, do you look at yourself in the mirror, Doug?
I try not to.
Exactly. So, you know, when you say I look sensational, I go, really? It's like, I don't know. It's not, those doesn't exactly go together. It's like,
you look okay.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, I feel better. The first film I ever made, I'm in my late 20s, and it's a film in which you get on the river, go down the river, and get off the river. That's the story of the film. But over time, the films become a kind of, like you see this sort of life of these young people in the 70s, and they're naked, and we're naked, and we're living a kind of outdoor, ecstatic experience, and it's before we've made choices in our lives to become whatever it is we become. You know, we got married, we had children, we had careers of some sort, many of us, and the film sort of stands in from before that. And 20 years later, I filmed 5 of those people over 4 years and intercut it with the old footage. And it's a film about what people do with their lives, what things look like, time passing, and the images of having gone from being young to middle-aged.
The ravages of time.
The ravages of time.
Did you know when you shot River Dogs that you would someday want to come back and do a follow-up?
When I shot River Dogs, I had no idea I would want to follow it up. I had no idea I would get middle-aged when I shot River Dogs. I mean, that's in itself seemed impossible. I was struggling in River Dogs just to stay afloat. I'd never made a film, really. I'd made a short film before that. But this was 35 days on the river. This was, you know, keeping the camera safe. This is huge rapids, and out there I had solar battery chargers. I didn't really know what I was doing. I had friends taking sound. I didn't bring enough sound. I brought reversal film. I was changing mags all the time. It was getting darker and darker because it was a fall trip. I was losing light. You know, I used reversal instead of negative because I didn't like the way that negative looked at that time. Maybe that was a good idea. Probably it was a horrible idea. I mean, I was just a very beginning filmmaker, and my friends were kind of sorry for me that I was out there filming them and instead of enjoying myself, and I was fighting with my girlfriend, and it was a mess. But there was something incredibly challenging and beautiful about trying to film this experience that I so valued, that I had spent 5 years between undergraduate school and graduate school not paying rent, and I just craved experience, and I traveled, and I went to Africa, I crossed the Sahara, I worked as a river guide, I lived outdoors, I studied Spanish in Mexico. I did basically anything but pay rent, and I was pretty good at that. And at the end of that, it was like filmmaking seemed like the thing that would allow me to maybe get better at something and to know the world in a certain way and to have experiences like those experiences in a different way, perhaps. And once I made that decision, I was really happy, never looked back and still have not looked back about that. It's like I was very fortunate to find something, the thing that I love to do. And River Dogs was that really first galvanizing experience of how hard that is and how interesting and how challenging. And if it wasn't, then you can't make a life doing it if it wasn't difficult. But because that film was hardly seen, it kind of had this kind of burning, was always in the back of my mind, unresolved. And at some point, I was on a river trip, you know, and I was on a river trip not long after I'd become a filmmaker, and I'd gotten married, and I had my first child, and I was out on the river, and I could just look at the river, and I just kind of went, I wonder whether I can film this movement from being young to having moved through some ideas and film it. Could you film it? And I started filming my friends from that trip, and I filmed 5 of them over 4 years, and intercut it with the old footage. And I worried a lot about that the then and now was kind of wonderful, but it had to mean something different, like a poem means something different if you come back to the same line deeper into the poem, that the same line has to mean something different over the course of the poem for it to work. And I feared a lot that it would be you'd cut back from the then and the now, or the now and the then, and that you do it once and it would be, oh wow, look at that, that was then and this is now. And you do it a second time and it was like, oh, look. And then the third time it's like, I got it, that was then and this is now, like what else do you have to say? And the trying to figure out what else I have to say and how to build that into the visual scheme of the film was something that I did with Karen Schmier, who was the first time I ever worked with an editor, was working with Karen. Karen was fantastic. I mean, she was just a pleasure to come to work every day with and to think about these things and to think about editing. And I don't think I could have made this film without her.
It's interesting because The Same River Twice was very well received, and yet that was the last personal documentary you've done. Is there a reason why you turned away from the form that created you?
I didn't make a considered decision to not make more autobiographical work, and I always thought that I would make more autobiographical work. But there was a period of time after The Same River Twice where the contemporary politics was the thing that was bugging me. There was like, it was so upsetting what was happening in world politics, and I wanted to think about bigger issues in a sort of conversational way. So, and I teamed up with a guy that I teach with, and we've made two films together. One about government secrecy and its relationship to national security and democracy. So it's a big idea, and it was before Snowden and before the NSA revelations and before Julian Assange. So it was trying to imagine this problem of taking things out of our ability to understand, like what happens when you remove knowledge from our ability to make good decisions about what the world is like and what our political decisions are. This was very much not a personal film, although it has some personal qualities. I liked the challenge of doing something very different. If I was going to collaborate with somebody, it didn't make sense for me to make the same kind of film I would make on my own. So how would we merge our sensibilities? And it seemed like doing something very different, taking on the challenges of doing something very different, was appealing to me. We moved into a second film together, which we're just now finished, about containing nuclear materials and how you keep it safe in the present and for the next 10,000 years. When I shot River Dogs, I never thought about dying, never occurred to me. I thought about drowning. I thought about falling off cliffs, but it never occurred to me that I was going to die, over time. And now I'm aware of that. And it doesn't mean it's tomorrow, and I don't know when it's going to be, but I know that I'm working within a limited time frame, and that awareness changes a lot of things. And that our life choices begin to show up in a different way. We begin to make certain kinds of decisions or experience the world in different ways. I don't know what that is exactly, but that seems to me the topic of a Third River film. The Tourist started with a problem I was having filming in the Third World, generally in jobs, that I would be hired to go off and film in Ethiopia or Nicaragua or someplace. And it made me uncomfortable. And it seems like often I make films when there's something that makes me uncomfortable, and then I just poke the camera at it and make myself more uncomfortable and see what that looks like. And in that case, it was the ways in which putting a frame around things, trying to make sense of things, especially in the Third World, you were trafficking in imagery, and that basically it was a transaction. It was a kind of power relationship that made me feel awkward, that I'd go into people's lives and I'd film them and I'd be concerned about the framing or the exposure or the focus. And, these people were often living in very hard circumstances. You film people starving to death in Ethiopia, which I did. And like, what is that? And can people say no? And they're in refugee camps, and they understand that their livelihood, that their very lives and the lives of their family are dependent on the people in the camp. And the people in the camp have said it's okay for these people to film, and you don't speak their language, and you show up with a camera and you film them. And I found that very disquieting. very unsettling. And
you also know that they're not going to see the film.
and I know they're not. Yes, absolutely. And they're not going to see the film on top of that. And I'm not held accountable in that way. I started bringing extra film to film around the edges of that experience. And I tried for a couple of years. Partly had to wait for jobs to come up and, opportunities to go film. But more than that, I found myself recording the things that bothered me and then discussing the things that bothered me on the editing table. And I was replicating in the editing table what I was experiencing in the shooting, which is a kind of distance. And at the same time, my then wife, Jean, and I were trying to get pregnant and doing a pretty bad job of it. And that was a really complicated and difficult time. And so I'd be on the road filming other people's lives for my livelihood, and then at home trying to get pregnant and trying to stay pregnant. And in both instances, it made me feel like a kind of tourist in my life. And that became a kind of autobiographical essay about feeling that way. It brought to the fore our struggle and gave it a kind of substance. And I think there was something, for both of us, there was something strong and reassuring about that this was important, things that were going on in our life, and it seemed kind of worthy of a film topic. And I think reassuring that while I was off going to all these places to shoot, I was also carrying our story with us. And I would return and film it and then go out on the road and return and film us. And I think that was reassuring. And then it also led to something that was more than reassuring. It was like one of the greatest things that ever happened to me, which is adopting our first child. So that was great. And that was a really good story. And I think for both of us, it seemed like a story that could be, in a world of very negative stories about adoption, it was a positive story about adoption. And we liked that and wanting to share that sort of maybe allowed us to share more than we might have otherwise.
I mean, it's funny and a bit ironic because in a way, to tell these kinds of intimate stories to a larger audience, you almost have to feel like you're a character in a story as opposed.
Of course.
Now let's talk about that a bit.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the autobiographical stories, God, it's complicated. I mean, in a way, when you film in the third person, there's an assumption that the idea exists in the world. It's a kind of fact of the world. And maybe you're not filming facts, but you're filming something that exists out there. But autobiographical stories are summoned by the experience of the filmmaker. And they don't exist without the presence of the filmmaker. They're summoned into the world. And so the filmmakers themselves become the agent for what's actual about it and what's real. And then that's a whole, we become a character that people have to accept as the storyteller for the story to then be told. There's a kind of, something has to happen in front of the story, which is the storyteller's credibility as a storyteller. Whether we believe them, or whether we like them, or whether we accept them, whether we feel like we would in any personal story. Is there an agenda, a secret agenda that we don't know? Does the filmmaker have enough self-awareness to tell the story? Even if they don't know everything, do we trust them, their kind of honesty or their ability to interrogate themselves to tell the story? It's the kind of prerequisite for the story to be told. And if you don't feel that, then you dismiss the story outright. I mean, all films have to have a way in, and you have to trust the filmmaker at some level, but there's an extra burden for autobiographical filmmakers that they themselves have to be a credible storyteller for the thing to go on and for the film not to be dismissed. There's a way in which, when autobiographical films don't work, people hate them. I just hate them. They're self-indulgent. They're awful. Why does anybody do this? It's like the worst. And really what they're saying, I think, is that when people don't know themselves and put on display they're not knowing themselves, there's something very embarrassing about that, and you want to avert your eyes.
These films are like rarely, if ever, honored. I don't know, do people just think it's easy to tell these kinds of stories? Or why is that?
It's hard to know exactly why autobiographical work isn't honored exactly in the same way that other kinds of documentaries are. Partly we're in an age of documentary films that are required to change the world, and that's what funders like, and it's become, there's a kind of chokehold on certain kinds of narratives that a three-act structure, character-driven, highly topical metrics for changing the world. This isn't bad. I mean, there's many good things to say about that, and we want films, I want films that are about the deep problems of the world and maybe offering some solutions, maybe not, but at least exploring them. I think that's a very good use of nonfiction. But if that's all that nonfiction is, then we lose depth and breadth and complexity and formal invention and the idea that people's individual experiences are the currency of all of our lives. And how do you express that? And that ought to be in the forefront as well.
Talk about the craft. I mean, like, is it the craft of the editing of complicated themes? Is it a kind of writing craft? Or is it all the other cinematic qualities into a story?
I mean, all films require that you find a way to tell the story of that film in a way that's consistent with the story you're telling. And that in autobiography, often that starts with a shooting. That there's something about the presence of the camera, how the world is seen by the camera and by the person holding the camera. That takes a huge amount of work. I mean, in your films or in Ross's films, the presence of the camera, the particularity of that, the way in which it's maybe too much to call it a character, or maybe it's exactly right to call it a character, that if the character is seeing something, and that seeing is embodied in the camera and the way that things are seen, the way that you make people feel, the way that you allow the world to present itself, takes an extreme amount of discipline and focus and aesthetic choices to make it seem natural. And having a camera in the middle of one's life is deeply unnatural. So working through that to get to something that allows the world to be comfortable enough for it to, the meanings of which and the personalness of which is able to bubble up out of the things that you're seeing. I think it starts there, I think, in autobiography. It starts with the shooting. It's a kind of shooting in which you mean to allow people to be themselves, and that the fact of being themselves or the act of being themselves is the subject of your film. And that it lets things in instead of excluding them. Often in documentaries, you're filming a piece of the world and that you have to keep focusing, well, is this scene about what the film's about? And in autobiography, it's often, that's somewhat true, but really it's about letting the thing happen over time. And that's a very different idea about how to shoot, and in a way makes things seem naturalistic and inevitable in a way that maybe makes the filmmaking choices invisible.
What would you warn people about? Anybody thinking, I'm really inspired now to tell stories about my life.
I'm sure this film will make people want to do that. It's like, that's our fun to stuff. And in a way, it's great. I mean, making autobiographical work is really fantastic. But it puts you and those around you in a certain kind of jeopardy that's very difficult to control, because you're putting your ideas and your life in a very personal way. You're turning your life into material. You're turning people that you love into characters and into material. You're shaping them and you're putting them up for the public to regard. And then the public is not controllable. People respond in very different ways for all kinds of reasons that you can't quite make happen and if people don't like your film and they don't like that person or they don't like you, it's hard not to take that personally, and that's very hard. In fact, you've turned things into characters and you've turned your life into a kind of story. But there's this twin obligation. On the one hand, documentary autobiographical filmmakers have to be deeply themselves, like they're as real people, and you have to be credible as a real person, and you're turning yourself into a character, and that character is not yourself. It's some version of yourself that's been turned into something else, and that twin obligation is incredibly difficult to negotiate. And people then have responses. Oh, I thought your wife was right in that argument, or I can't believe that she had that to say. That's ridiculous. Or like, why did you do that? That just seemed like stupid. Like why did you do that, Doug? Why did you say that? It just seems so dumb. People bring all kinds of things, and you're subjecting yourself to that kind of scrutiny, and that people think they're talking about you and your life, and they're sort of talking about a movie. Yet you want them to talk about it as if it's your life, because that's the conceit of the film.
What's crossing the line to film? Like, where would you not go with something? Or give an example maybe of something that you just felt is like too much.
It's so perfect you're asking me about saying what's too much, because it's too much, so I shouldn't say it. And that tension is all over autobiography, like where that line is between what you disclose and what you don't, and why. I actually think you should film everything. That if there's something that somebody says, you can't film this, then I don't film that. It's like, and I want people to know that it's okay. If there's something, cameras are so acquisitive, and that if people don't feel that they have the right to say no, then they can't really say yes. So it's like, if they really want to say no, I want to set that bar high, not just, I don't like the way I look, or, that shirt makes me look ridiculous. Like, not such things. But if somebody really hates something, or there's something just too personal, I think it's okay to not put it in the film, and and to not film it if they ask you not to film. I think that's for me, that's an important line. But short of that, I think you shouldn't decide for people whether it's okay or not. And you don't know what's actually okay or what's not. You just don't know the answer to that. And there's something a little patronizing about being too careful, like protecting people. If I'm just feel like this really can't be filmed, like I see why this is horrible and they don't, and I totally see it as horrible or something, then I might, not film that. I think there's ways in which I might not film that. But in general, if something's hard or difficult or emotional, I think hard, difficult, and emotional is the realm of filmmaking. If it goes beyond that, into something damning, actionable, so morally repugnant that you can't, makes your skin crawl, then maybe I won't film it. But it ought to be in that realm in which you don't film. Yeah. Just difficult, complex, emotional. I think that's all part of the filmmaking process.